All right, this video is about for your midterm. Um, I will be discussing Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you a list of questions via email that you'll email me back. Um, and you'll answer the questions based upon this lecture. This course, History 369, covers the Great Depression and World War II, and part of this course is the New Deal. Now, let me discuss, first of all, what the New Deal was. In 1932, there was a presidential election, and it pitted the Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover against his Democratic rival, the governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Uh, During the 1932 campaign, Roosevelt told the country that he was going to offer them what he called a New Deal. Now, he didn't specify exactly what that meant, but very clearly, and this is important, Roosevelt was a Democrat who believed, unlike Hoover, that there should be much more government involvement in the economy to combat the Great Depression. And this is the origins of what we know today as liberalism or progressivism. In the 1932 election, Franklin Roosevelt crushed Hoover. Hoover only won a few states. Franklin Roosevelt got 57% of the vote. Further, the Democrats in the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives had overwhelming majority. So what that meant was that the Democrats would be able to enact legislation in Congress, create laws, sign them, create bills, sign them, send them to Franklin Roosevelt, who would sign them into law. And that is what happened. Um, Back then, presidential inauguration was held in March, and Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in March of 1933. And in his inaugural address, he said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He promised the country that he would work to end the New Deal, end the Great Depression. And he set about this by, like I said earlier, signing uh, bills into law, creating government agencies, issuing orders, and taking fairly drastic steps to combat the Great Depression. Uh, by March of 1933, 25% of the country was unemployed. Another 25% was underemployed. 37 of 48 states had closed their banks. Over 7,000 banks had ceased to exist in the previous several years. People had lost their life savings. Um, During the fall of 1932, many farmers across the country had ceased to even harvest their crops because they weren't getting any money for them. Much of the American economy had simply shut down. This was an unprecedented situation. The world's economy was also faltering. And in March of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt comes in and he says that he is going to offer the country hope, that he's going to restore um, um, the economy, but it will take time. Now, beginning in March of 1933, Roosevelt offers um, several initiative programs, and historians have dubbed these part of the first New Deal. That is beginning in March of 1933 and really going to about 1934. Congress passes a bunch of bills that Roosevelt signs into law that create agencies, laws, programs designed to combat, at first, the misery of the Great Depression. If you think of the New Deal programs offered by Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats were targeted at relief, that is, provide people immediate relief, recovery, which would come later on, start to grow the economy, and then finally reform. That is, you try to enact policies that will ensure that there will never be another Great Depression and also bring about something that is called social justice. The first New Deal included programs such as a civilian conservation corps that hired young men to work in public parks. There was something known as the Public Works Administration, hiring Americans to work for the government to build things such as roads and bridges. The government began to hire people to work in an effort to ease the unemployment situation. Franklin Roosevelt declared a bank holiday. That is, the nation's banks were shut down for about a week. And then the government sent bureaucrats, government agents, to examine the remaining banks to see which ones were solvent. And once it was determined which banks could stay open, they were reopened. But significantly after this, the government then offered deposit insurance. That is, beginning in 1933, if you deposited money into a bank, it was federally insured if your bank closed. Now, at the time, it was up to $5,000. So if you had a bank account of $3,000 and your bank for some reason closed, the government would cover that. They would send you a check for $3,000. So you now have the government getting involved in protecting the nation's banks and people's life savings. The stock market had crashed. Now, the stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression. It was a trigger of it. But now there's an agency called the Securities and Exchange Commission that will regulate the stock market and provide government oversight of the stock market, something that didn't exist before. All of these things are an effort to try to provide immediate relief for people and to make sure that the economy didn't get worse. There was an Agricultural Adjustment Act, and what this did was it provided subsidies to farmers. The government would send checks to farmers. Farmers would agree that they would not grow certain crops, and that was an effort to raise the prices of agricultural goods because one of the reasons for the Great Depression was farmers were actually losing money because they were producing too many things. So this is the first New Deal, and again, it goes between about 1933 to 1934. Roosevelt is a Democrat. The Democrats control the United States House. They control the United States Senate. And the Democrats are becoming a liberal party. That is, they believe that it's the responsibility of the government to enact social change, to bring about social justice, end inequality, and protect people from society because they believe society is unfair. Which brings us to something known as the Second New Deal. In 1934, there were congressional elections. You have that every 2 years. And in the United States House and the United States Senate, if you look on your PowerPoint, you'll see the numbers are staggering. The Democrats control 70 of 96 seats in the United States Senate. They have over 300 of the 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives. The Democrats are the dominant party. The Republicans have been blamed for the Great Depression. Hoover and the Republicans, most voters thought that they were responsible for all the misery. So at this time, the Democratic Party is the clear, overwhelming majority party. And beginning in 1935, you have new legislation, which is historians call the Second New Deal. These programs are designed to ensure that there will never be another Great Depression, to protect the economy, and the second part is to bring about what they call reform. That is, I mentioned the 3 R's about the New Deal: relief, recovery, reform. The second New Deal is designed to create permanent structures in place that will bring about equality for many Americans, if not every American. The most significant part of the second New Deal is the Social Security Act of 1935. Now, it did provide for old age pensions, that is, for people over the age of 65. You put your money in, what you earn, and the government sends you a check based upon what you put into the Social Security Trust Fund. But it also had aid for the permanently disabled. Franklin Roosevelt had suffered an attack of polio. He was not able to walk after 1921, and he ensured that the Social Security Act provided aid for the disabled, for the permanently blind. It also had the beginning of welfare. There were so many households that simply did not have an income and yet had young children that the government began to send them checks at the beginning of welfare. This is what is meant by Social Security. That is, you have the government create laws, programs, agencies, and other things, money, that will provide for people in society security. Because, again, they believe that society is unfair. Liberal Democrats believe society is unfair. Therefore, it is the role of the government to step in and provide security. So the New Deal last began in 1933. It goes through the rest of the 1930s. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president first in 1932. He's reelected in 1936 in an overwhelming majority. The Democrats, as I mentioned, are the majority party. Franklin Roosevelt is ranked by many historians as one of the greatest presidents in the country's history. He will be reelected in 1940 and then in 1944, back when presidents could serve more than 2 terms. He also leads the country during World War II, which is something I will discuss. Historians credit the New Deal with ensuring that the Great Depression didn't get any worse, that it provided so many Americans with security, that it saved the nation's banking system, the nation's agricultural system, and that it was very popular. People kept voting for Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats because, unlike Hoover, they believed that Roosevelt and the Democrats were really helping them. Now, many of the laws that were created back then still exist. Social Security, obviously. The Agricultural Adjustment Agency is still around today, providing subsidies for farmers. So historians also say, well, it's successful because it has lasted so long. Now, a counter to this, that perhaps it wasn't so successful, was that the New Deal actually never really solved the Great Depression. As I mentioned, when Roosevelt took office, 25% of the country was unemployed. When he left office by 1940, the economy was recovering, but that was only because World War II had started. And it wasn't the New Deal that really ended the Great Depression as much as it was World War II. The New Deal also began to create government bureaucracies. It raised taxes, and again, it really didn't solve the New Deal. So Hoover, who would live until 1964, would spend the rest of his life saying, see, I was right, the New Deal was a failure. So in the questions I'm going to ask are going to be based upon this lecture. I will type them up. I have them typed up. I will send them to you, and you'll email them back to me. And that will constitute your midterm.